Today, our guest, Clincy, is a PhD graduate in material science at UCLA and an incoming consultant at Bain. We met recently on his brief visit to Asia, and I was immediately impressed by his expertise across multiple STEM disciplines. Today, we're lucky to have him share his recent deep obsession with radiopharmaceuticals, an emerging life-saving science that is revolutionizing cancer diagnostic and treatment. To start, perhaps I'll read out a tweet that you shared with me in our previous conversation. It describes radiopharmaceutical as an once a dormant space that has rapidly grown over the past few years. And since 2018, there has been 3 novel FDA-approved therapeutics, over $1 billion in investor funding, and over $10 billion in M&A and licensing deals. With a current industry pipeline showing 60-plus clinical stage and 100-plus preclinical assets. With you having this front row seat, witnessing this gold rush and the rapid growth in this industry, perhaps my first question is, what prompted your obsession with this emerging science? What got you interested in it?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. And I really just kind of got into it because I was really involved with, tech transfer work at, UCLA, which is the university where I did my PhD. And one professor decided to commercialize this technology, and I decided to just help him do the due diligence on this technology, just by going through everything in the industry, from the competition to how the market functioned, and all the technicals associated with how radiopharmaceuticals is distributed and used by the end user. I've had a couple members of my family with cancers, and I've had a couple friends who have also luckily got into remission as well. And that kind of got me thinking that there are a bunch of people with stage 3 and 4 cancers who are terminal or might be terminal that really don't have another option. But when I came across radiopharmaceuticals during my due diligence, this was one option. As you mentioned, there are 3 approved drugs for for cancers, and 2 of them involve solving 2 very tough types of cancers, where it's generally approved for people who are in stage 3 and 4 prostate cancer or a different form of pancreatic cancer. And this provides another line of defense for those patients to be able to have a chance to live a lot longer and not have to say goodbye to their loved ones.
Right. It's definitely a very impactful field that if we can popularize it across different hospitals and apply on to different patients, could see very drastic improvements to the way we deal with cancer.
Yeah.
But before we go deep down different rabbit holes, we can take a step back and understand cancer and radiopharma in general.
Yeah.
So why don't you give us an overview of what is cancer, the different stages, and your definition of radiopharma?
Yeah.
How does it fit into the picture?
Yeah. So I guess I'm no oncologist, so I think I'll just give kind of the how I see cancer in the context of how radiopharma can really kind of help. So generally, cancer, it's broken down into multiple types and subtypes, and then you have stage 1 to 4, where it varies from localized all the way to distant, meaning that it's spread everywhere in the body. So as I mentioned, that radiopharmaceuticals are really good. Excuse me. Are really good for stage 3 and 4 cancers because, as I'll mention in a second, that that they have the ability to self-target to different bodily processes in your body to be able to attach to different cancer receptors and automatically hit those tumors in a very selective way. So kind of in stage 3 and 4 cancers, the reason why radiopharmaceuticals are so important is that having this mechanism allows a patient to avoid damage to healthy tissues. Conventionally, before this, you would rely on any kind of radiation therapy or chemotherapy Those
Or
are generally
surgeries.
and surgeries. Yeah, if you're in stage 1 and your surgery is just if your cancer is very local, you can simply have a surgery, take out the tumor,
Right.
and you can go home and you would live just as many years as you would had you not had that tumor. If the and you also have other options like radiation therapies. You have chemotherapy where it can simply just attack those tumors and do some damage to healthy tissue, but generally the risk is worth the reward to get rid of that tumor. When you're at stage 3 or 4, you have to use quite a bit more of chemotherapy, and it causes a lot more damage to healthy tissues around the surrounding area, on top of destroying tumor tissues. So your risk reward is a lot less balanced than it's a lot more imbalanced for stage 3 and 4 cancers, as well as radiation therapies. For radiation therapies, you basically target individual tumors, but if it's everywhere at that point, you basically are playing whack-a-mole with with distant tumors in your body. So this is where radiopharmaceuticals come in. And my definition of radiopharmaceuticals is somewhat broad. It's simply taking an organic compound that targets a specific biological process or attaches to a certain receptor in your body, and you're doing a chemical reaction in order to attach a radioisotope, basically a particle, an element that has an element that has unstable properties that causes it to release some sort of radiation. Either it would release gamma radiation or positron radiation, which gives you the ability of the organic compound to release radiation to be collected for imaging, such as in a positron emission tomography scan, and that gives you information about your bodily processes. For example, you can see where your glucose uptake is, wherever your body is consuming glucose. Essentially, you can view things like cell division, where your body is, your body is dividing cells more quickly than usual, which is typically a hallmark of a tumor. Or you can take that same organic compound and label it or react it with another radioisotope that has a different type of radioactive emission. In certain cases, it's electron radiation, which can be used to irradiate tumors in a very selective way, as I mentioned. Or you can also react it with something that releases alpha radiation, which also destroys tumors, sometimes more effectively, but in a much more small radius, meaning that it destroys even less healthy cells.
Right. So I think just to summarize and to understand it better, the main pain point or the bottleneck for solving cancer, the conventional treatments, is they're not targeted because of the properties of cancer such that it spreads across the body, right? This is the reason why it is so hard to cure.
Mm-hmm.
However, radiopharma comes through with a potential solution by exactly offering, as you said, a guided missile, perhaps to target those localized cancer cells while preserving the healthy cells in the other parts of the body.
Yeah, it's like almost giving a sniper with a map, right? Instead of using like if you have a stage 3 and 4 tumor, it's almost like akin to, if you do radiation therapy, it's almost like kind of basically carpet bombing your body with radiation. It's going to do other damage to your other tissues, and chances are you might not even get rid of the tumor target that you intended to get rid of in the first place.
Yeah. As one of the cutting-edge cancer treatments, how has this science evolved over the course of last 10, 20 years? And I guess what led to this, what catalyzed this gold rush recently that we are seeing this growth of momentum and activity in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. So radiopharmaceuticals have been around for, I haven't done too much on focus on the history, but I'm aware that they've been around for since at least 1950. There have been things like just like radioactive iodine, for example, has been used for like thyroid cancer treatments. If you have stage 1 thyroid cancer, I had a friend with stage 1 thyroid cancer, and she took a very specific just iodine solution with some radioactive iodine, and the thyroid typically takes up the iodine, takes up a lot of iodine compared to the rest of the body. So that in itself is kind of the first form of targeted therapy for cancers. What really catalyzed this industry over the past 20 years, for example, was a company called Advanced Accelerator Applications in Europe. And they started around 2003, and they took the principle where you can take take an organic compound. In this case, they were specifically targeting a class of neuroendocrine tumors, and they realized that there was a receptor that was overexpressed in that specific type of cancer, and they found a compound that binds to that specific type of receptor. They then took that compound and decided to label it or react it with a radioisotope called lutetium, which gives off electron radiation, which would destroy any kind of cells that are near it. So the idea was that they took that compound that goes specifically to that specific class of neuroendocrine tumors, and they would attach that that sniper payload, and then essentially that would go and irradiate all the tumors in a very localized fashion. And they spent about 12 years developing that drug asset all the way to phase 3 clinical trials, and they had to go through one rejection before they ultimately got it approved. And when it got approved in 2018, then in 2018, Novartis bought the drug bought the company and for the drug asset. And then after that, they also bought a company called Endocyte, which developed the same kind of class of drug for prostate cancers as well. That was another $2.1 billion. So in total, they spent about $6 billion to be able to develop market leadership in this, in these kind of first-in-class drugs. And ever since, there have been a whole lot of startups that have either just launched using private money or launched using, using research from a university and then adding some private backing on top of that and spinning out of the university to be able to develop this drug asset to bring more candidates to the FDA targeting different cancers.
Right. So it seems like the science and technology has been there for a while. Mm-hmm. What took the FDA so long to approve this kind of treatment, in your view?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in regulatory affairs, but the FDA is generally more conservative with really any kind of drug approval. But especially for a drug like this, it's never been proven in this very specific instance. So Lutathera, which is the drug that I mentioned that Advanced Accelerator Applications had got approved for neuroendocrine tumors, that was the very first-in-class drug. So they had rejected it first on the grounds that there wasn't enough safety data and not enough data on efficacy, that it showed that patients would live longer to the point where it justified the risk of using the medicine. But then they spent more time doing clinical trials, and then they ultimately got that approved. So I think it's really just regulatory conservatism that might be that is just present in most drug approvals, that was kind of applied a little bit more considering this was a first-in-class drug. That really kind of delayed it,
Right, especially for its application on the life and death situations,
right,
like cancer.
Right.
And I think as we delve deeper into the science of it, I think a big improvement from the previous class of treatment is the ability to see where the cancer cells are and target them. Right. Mm-hmm. That's the property with radiopharma. Perhaps related to that is the development of PET scans. Mm-hmm. So I guess how did we get to where we are today with the imaging technologies that allows or paves the way for radiopharma? Yeah. It came from our previous conversations that I learned the PET scan is it was a major contributor to this revolution, right?
Right.
And how did it start, and how is it different from the CTs, the X-rays, the MRIs that we know?
Yeah. So PET was actually PET, or positron emission tomography, was actually developed at UCLA's where I'm from, and one professor realized that you can even before advanced accelerator applications decided to take this an organic compound and label it with a therapy isotope. He realized that you can label a compound like glucose, for example, and then label it with an isotope called fluorine 18, which emits positrons, which ultimately releases a very specific wave, which releases a very specific energy of gamma radiation. And if you design your detectors for a specific type of scanner in a circular fashion, you can collect all those rays in a way that would generate an image. And after he realized that you can probably do this for a whole host of different organic compounds, not just imaging where glucose goes in your body. As I mentioned, you can do cell division. You can also image, where Alzheimer's plaques are in your brain to see the progression of Alzheimer's. You can image for Parkinson's. There's a lot of research going on to that. Compared to CT and MRI, it gets you a different set of images, one that shows you your bodily functions rather than just where your skeleton is, where your organs are, where some soft tissue is, especially in the case of MRI. There are benefits obviously to CT and MRI, but you'd have to see a physical change if you wanted to use it to screen for cancer, for example. For CT, it's used a lot it's used more and more in the U.S. for lung cancer screenings, but it relies on the fact that you have to have some lesions, meaning you have some kind of physical change on your lung to be able to see if that's a tumor or not. Using PET, you can see it with if you inject an injection of radioactive glucose, you can just see wherever there's a tumor by seeing wherever there's abnormal glucose uptake, which means typically there's more glucose consumption because there's more uncontrolled cell division. More uncontrolled cell division means there's more glucose being consumed. So that's kind of the advantage of using PET, and that's kind of how that was the motivation for developing the technique in the first place. And then even before we had therapies like from advanced accelerator applications, the better imaging enables doctors to be able to better understand how far the disease has progressed instead of just using a physical scan. And then that also informs them, for things like radiation therapy, which has existed for much longer than radiopharmaceutical therapies, is that you can better target that radiation and better treat the disease. So there was better disease management, and that's really what picked up. That's why hospitals picked up PET more and more for cancer management.
So I guess the imaging technologies came first.
Yeah.
And then the doctors realized, hey, why don't we, with this capabilities, why don't we have a class of drug that can both radiate to reflect the what's happening within the body, but also treat the cancer.
Right.
So I guess more moving to the radiopharma, the compound of it, the drug of it.
Yeah.
What are the different components? So as I understood, there's the component that attached to the cancer drugs, and also the part that lights up to show up in the images. Is that the I guess the breakdown of the compound?
Yeah. So it's two different compounds. So let's use the one by Advanced Accelerator.
Yeah.
For example. So they actually commercialized two different compounds, and it's based off the same organic compounds. So the organic compound was called TATE, T-A-T-E. It's an acronym for for the compound that attaches to this thing called the somatostatin receptor, which is overexpressed in neuroendocrine tumors. So this compound would attach to those specific cells wherever those tumors are. That's what is able to kind of give the roadmap for any kind of, they give the roadmap for where the compound, where the radioisotope should go, regardless of whether it's imaging or whether it's therapy. So you take that compound, you basically attach a chelator, which is a stabilizing kind of complex for the radioisotope afterwards to go on top of that to be able to stabilize it, so that make sure that while it's in your body, it doesn't break down while it's on the way to the tumor. So there's two separate. So using the same organic compound, they developed two separate compounds. So that organic compound, one of them, they used an imaging isotope, meaning that it would release positron radiation and by extension gamma. So that isotope is using gallium-68. So that organic compound labeled with gallium-68, that compound as a whole is used for the imaging. So when you inject that into someone, it illuminates wherever they have the neuroendocrine tumors in their body and how great that extent is. And then you take that second compound, which is also the same organic compound, but instead of having gallium-68 as the imaging isotope, you're attaching something called lutetium-177, which emits electrons instead. Now, electrons cannot be imaged because they don't by the time they don't penetrate outside of the body, while gamma can make it outside your body. That's why the scanner can collect it. So by using lutetium, by using the imaging agent first, you're finding out where the tumor is, and then you're using the therapy compound after that to basically treat it. And then you're basically just iterating again and again, because after you use the therapy compound, you want to find out to what extent the tumor has been attacked. And then you image it again to see where it is, whether it's receded or whether it's progressed. And then you just treat it again. And you kind of keep doing this until the tumor is gone. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is, number one, there are multiple classes of therapeutic compounds,
right.
And this roadmap compounds that attach to it depends on the type of cancer that we're aiming for, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So like the radioisotope is agnostic to the different types of cancers to a certain extent.
Yeah. Just to clarify, radioisotope is the imaging particle that illuminates the body.
Yeah.
Is it correct? Okay.
Radioisotopes are either it's any radioactive particle, and depending on the type of radiation releases, it determines whether it's the imaging radioisotope or the therapy radioisotope.
Okay.
And
so
then
it could be both imaging and therapy.
Individually, but not at the same time. Generally,
Okay.
There are a couple exceptions in the literature, but we wish that one could exist for both imaging and therapy at the same time, because that'd be ideal, right? If you do the therapy at the same time, you can image in real time where the therapy is going. There have been explorations in science for that, but generally what you have is right. It's the organic compound is generally the one that changes depending on what type of cancer you want to target. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how standard is the production process for these different radioisotopes? Perhaps now is a good segue into delving deeper into the industry aspect of this radiopharma.
Right.
Who are the biggest players in every segment? And I guess before that, what's the typical production process like?
Yeah.
In your view, yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting because there've only, as you said, there's only been 3 FDA approved radiopharmaceuticals. So we'll go with 2 of them. So the 2 drugs that have been approved by the FDA that have both been acquired by Novartis. So Novartis has 2 plants for the production of Lutathera, which is the one for neuroendocrine tumors, and I think the biggest challenge is that there isn't necessarily a standard yet, because there's only 2 drugs that have been approved. So essentially, Novartis can decide how they want to produce it in the safest and most effective way possible. It's still kind of up in the air for the industry how they want to produce radiopharmaceuticals in general, and it also differs from therapies to imaging agents. But let's start with the therapies. So there are a lot of therapies that still can be made. So as I mentioned, the radioactive therapy isotope that I mentioned, lutetium-177, has a half-life associated with it, which is around six or so days. So if you make it in a factory in Europe, you can ship it to the United States, and you'd still have a decent amount of it to be able to treat a patient with it. So that is also one of the things that's going to determine how the supply chain and how the production is going to look like. Because if your half-life is not 6 days, maybe it's 3 days, that really can determine where your manufacturing facilities are going to be placed around the world in order to serve your customers and ultimately your patients and all the stakeholders in the industry. So I'm not sure where the industry is going to be headed in terms of manufacturing capability. There's still a lot of, I think a bigger, more fundamental question is there's still kind of a jockeying between what isotope is going to win out. And lutetium is a good isotope, but it's been shown that certain cancers, certain cases of neuroendocrine cancers have still progressed even after you've treated it with this specific medicine. And as we were talking about just before recording this, one of the companies that is going public, Raise Bio, they basically took that same drug that Novartis has for neuroendocrine tumors, and they attached a different therapy isotope that has a half-life of 10 days. So they decided to establish a plant in Indianapolis where there is a FedEx hub, and for easy distribution of these medicines. But if the half-life is 10 days, then you basically have more time to be able to distribute this drug around the world, and you have more flexibility given that less of it will decay in transit. So I bring up that example because that's another area where that's a very scientific way to basically say that like it's still up in the air based on a lot of the nuances of how some of these medicines are made and what you technically use.
Right.
So
yeah, I guess to bring it back to the basics, because I've done some of the homework in advance, but just for the general population, for any radioactive compound, radioactive decay is part of the properties that's built in, right? So
Right.
if you see any compound that emits energy, it will have a half-life.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So what is half-life? Just very quickly.
Right. So half-life is the amount of time that it takes for a radioactive isotope to lose basically half of it. So
Right.
the nature of a radioactive particle is that it's unstable. So it's either releasing energy or particles from its nucleus, and it's decaying to a different element. And the half-life, if it's 6 days, for example, that means that if you started with a certain amount of radioactive material, after 6 days, you'll have exactly half, or around half of that material left. And then after another 6 days, you'll have half of that. So depending on what isotope you use for therapy, that really can determine your supply chain and how many of those facilities you have to have, and how centralized that facility can be, and how much scale you can have in the business.
Right, and I find that is a very interesting element or constraint to this industry. It's completely determined by the manufacturing process. It is determined by the properties of the chemical compound you're producing.
Right, and you're basically at the mercy of physics, right? You know, and it's funny because I think this might be a good point to add, is that for conventional pharma, you don't have this limitation where you have to have perhaps a lot more manufacturing sites depending on how long your half-life is. Even for Moderna and Pfizer, when they made their vaccines, a cold chain is very difficult to navigate around, but nonetheless it's possible. And you can still make a lot of vaccines, at a single facility, just like Pfizer can make like a billion pills at a single facility, and you can simply just batch test. You can just test one batch out of those billion pills and ensure that a large portion of that batch is going to be safe, right? You can take multiple batches and you can do all the quality control at that centralized facility. Depending on how your half-life is going to work out for your commercialized drug, depending on what isotope you chose to use, you have to do quality control every so often because you have to make a new batch every time a patient requires a new treatment. So that's the unique thing about radiopharmaceuticals. Because of the nature scientifically of how radiopharmaceuticals work, that really determines how complex your supply chain is and how regulatorily burdensome your business is, which it's understandable. You want to have safe and effective medicines delivered to your patients, but it's something that we can't really get past.
Right.
Yeah.
So how are the companies navigating this? I think you mentioned they build plants near FedEx distribution centers. Perhaps they have multiple plants across different regions.
Right.
So how are they navigating this right now?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So I think that this is where it also goes beyond just the logistics. So if you're talking about Raise Bio, the company that I just mentioned had an IPO, and comparing it with Novartis, for example, they just simply established a plant, in Indianapolis and Europe, respectively. But beyond that, they also have to rely on a nuclear supply chain for the lutetium and some of the other radioactive isotopes that they have to use for their therapies. So because those are produced in a nuclear reactor. So that's one of the very significant portions of the supply chain that is the limiting factor to how many people can get these therapies in the first place. And I think what you were probably asking is basically how they were going to be setting up plants to be able to meet this kind of demand. But beyond that, they have to make sure that they can get the isotope in the first place. And in order to get that isotope, they are arranging with a lot of nuclear power providers to basically recover the byproduct that was normally useless, and now they're repurposing it, repurposing what would have become nuclear waste to something that is now a part of life-saving therapy. So that's how they're dealing with the supply chain right now. There's some other companies that are experimenting with different kinds of radioisotopes instead of lutetium-177 or actinium-225. This is probably gibberish coming out of my mouth a little bit, but they're also experimenting with a different isotope of lead, for example, one that's not like the one that's conventionally toxic to us. It's a different isotope that releases a type of radiation that is very effective for destroying tumors, and that one is produced in a nuclear reactor as well, but that one has that one can be produced with basically like a parent isotope that decays all the way down, that lasts a lot longer, and then it can be basically produced on demand in a very compact fashion. I won't get too much into the details of how that works, but there are a lot of companies that when a company deals with the supply chain for the therapy isotopes, they deal a lot with how to source those isotopes in the first place, not necessarily how the plant is built. So even though the plant is a large cost.
Right. So as we're more talking more on the supply chain for this industry, I guess what does supply chain mean here? What's the upstream, midstream, downstream segments from even the equipment makers to, I guess, the compound manufacturers, and then I guess contract manufacturers, and then to the big pharmas. So I think for a lot of us outsiders, when we think about drugs, we thought it's just a simple process made by the company that brands it and sells it. But I guess from our previous conversation, there's a long supply chain, can be very fragmented. And a lot of different industry players come together to make this happen, right? So just give us a breakdown of different industry segments and how did we get from chemical elements on Earth to a drug that we put into people's mouth and veins
Yeah.
for curing cancer. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing is that the conversation we had was for a totally different portion of the supply chain as well. So the one that I just talked about. So as I mentioned, there's the imaging compound and the therapy compound.
Right.
So the plants that I talked about were for the therapy compound.
Right.
The one with the 6-day half-life, for example, where you can afford to centralize the therapy compound, manufacture pretty large batches, and you can ship it out to patients via plane, and it can be injected, because you still have enough of it after the amount of time it takes to transport, because it takes 6 days to lose half of it.
Right.
A totally separate supply chain for the imaging compounds exists as well, because you have different isotopes for those. And unfortunately for those are a lot shorter. So the most common isotope that is used is fluorine-18, and the half-life for that is 109 minutes. So after 109 minutes, you lose half of it. So generally about 8 hours, the shelf life on your material is the shelf life on your compound is gone. You can't really have enough to image a patient anymore. So let's kind of go through how those are made, because imaging isotopes, the supply, the logistics are a little more intensive than say therapy isotopes, even though the therapy isotopes would require a whole plant to be able to supply them. So starting from the starting from for the imaging isotopes, so you basically take the isotope. So let's use fluorine-18 for example. You would have something called a cyclotron, which the room that we're in right now is about I'd say maybe 15 by 15, so about 225 square feet.
Yeah.
Or for anybody else not in the United States, about 20 square meters.
Is that the size of a cyclotron?
Yeah, that's about the size of the cyclotron, if from edge to edge, top to bottom, in a cubic way. And you probably need room on top of that to be able to have people go through there, and then also on top of that you need to have a large vault to be able to contain all of the radiation while it's in operation. But we won't get too much into that. So starting from there, you would require this $2 million piece of equipment to produce that isotope in the first place.
And that's the imaging isotope.
Yeah, that's the imaging isotope. Just the particle that releases the radiation that you have to combine with the organic compound.
Right.
So that's the next step in the process. You synthesize the compound by taking that organic compound and reacting it with the imaging isotope to create one single compound that has the ability to release radiation. That compound is then purified and then formulated to get into the efficacy for the patient, as well as in the in the volume that is necessary to get into the patient's veins and be effective essentially. We won't get too much into that. After that, you have to quality control test each one of these batches that you make, and then after that you dispense each of those doses into individual syringes, and then you send them off into different hospitals. So as you can imagine, one of these labs can cost anywhere from $4 to $6 million, including the cyclotron and all the equipment to do radiation protection, all of the staff, all of the quality control equipment that is necessary. And this is all very specialized labor that is required to be able to make these compounds.
It's a massive investment.
Extremely massive investment. And part of how the model works is that there's one very specific compound that is called FDG. So it's essentially a glucose that has been reacted with a fluorine-18 molecule. So that basically when it's injected into someone, it basically goes into wherever the body takes up glucose. And typically, as I said, wherever the body takes up more glucose, that's typically where a tumor is. And it covers a lot of different types of tumors around your body. So if it covers a lot of different cancer indications and types, that means there's a lot of there's a lot of demand for it, because the size of the population cancer patients that you can address is larger. So there's enough demand to justify this investment. So what commercial radiopharmacies, which are essentially the contract manufacturers for this specific drug. Well, this drug is out of patent, so they can manufacture it directly without having to pay any owner of this drug patent. So what they've done is essentially they've made large batches of this drug, and whatever hospital needs it, they basically tell them, like the night before they need this dose, or a few days before, depending on the radiopharmacy. They make a batch of maybe anywhere from 500 to 1,000 doses, and they split, all those doses among a bunch of different hospitals to be able to make it economical for them. And they have to do this basically every single day, right? Because since the half-life of fluorine-18 is 109 minutes, you can't simply just make, 1 billion doses like
Right.
Bayer or Pfizer does,
Yeah.
and hope that it will last for 2 years. Because by the end of 8 hours, you'll lose most of it. So essentially, you have to make a new batch every single day, and then kind of just start the day over and over again, and just keep going. So it's an incredible amount of investment for each radiopharmacy to make this drug, and as a result, the industry only has one single drug because there's enough cancer patients to do it. It's generally cheap enough to make, and there's enough demand to support the capital investment of these companies. And there's been plenty of companies who have waded into this industry and have ended up going bankrupt because they either overestimated demand, and they have a bunch of equipment that is so specialized that can't be repurposed for any other types of imaging drugs, because this is the only one that has enough demand to justify making enough doses to cover the cost of reimbursement and covering the cost of your equipment by extension.
Right.
Yeah.
So as you mentioned, the imaging compound and therapeutic compound each has its own supply chain.
Yeah.
It also depends on the radioisotope, the kind of chemical you're producing. It requires specialized machinery equipments as well.
Yeah, and here's kind of to kind of just zoom out and get a slightly higher level view. So for example, like fluorine-18 is used to image glucose, for example. But let's take the example, or fluorine-18, for example. There are around the entire country, for fluorine-18 radiopharmacies, there's a company called Cardinal Health. They're a large provider of, tongue depressors and just a bunch of general medical equipment, but they happen to have a radiopharmacy presence. So around the country, they have 30 of these sites with about 30 cyclotrons that produce this drug, FDG, the radioactive glucose. And keep in mind the half-life, again, is 109 minutes. But if you take the drug that Novartis has produced with their therapy drug for neuroendocrine tumors, the imaging portion of that is made with gallium-68, not fluorine-18, and the half-life on that is 68 minutes. So every 68 minutes, instead of 109, you lose half of it. So essentially what has happened in how that is reflected in the industry is that so Cardinal Health distributes gallium-68 radiopharmaceuticals. And instead of having just 30 sites they have 190 sites to be able to distribute gallium-68 radiopharmaceuticals compared to 30 or so sites for F-18. So your half-life really determines your kind of destiny,
Right.
in terms of how broad your presence has to be in order to produce these certain radiopharmaceuticals for patient use.
Right. I think radiopharma is an industry is a prime example for having a room for government to step in with subsidies and incentives for companies to build out the supply chain, because, as you said, the scale is really important here, and a lot of the cancer classes may be overlooked if we just focus on the economics.
Yeah.
Has there been the push from different lobby agencies, big pharma, to increase investments in there, and different government policies coming out?
I think there have been I haven't looked at the deal flow too much on this, but there have definitely been some companies that I've paid attention to where there are companies that there's a lot of focus on the producing the isotopes, for example, and there's been a lot of research by the Department of Energy to be able to fund via grants to private companies that have technologies in, particle accelerators, for example, to come up with alternative ways to produce certain therapy isotopes to increase the amount of supply for so that more cancer patients can be treated. So there's that kind of government investment in that sense. I think the more important aspect to look into for this class of drugs is really the FDA portion of the regulatory portion. So this comes in really important for imaging drugs, for example. So imaging drugs, for any of them really, you're not injecting enough to have a therapeutic effect. You're injecting just enough. So basically, like if you inject any any kind of organic compound, right? Like let's say you use OxyContin, the pain reducer. If you only inject very, very little of it, it's not going to have a therapeutic effect because there's a therapeutic window that you need to exceed, for example. So radiopharmaceuticals don't exceed this therapeutic window, so they don't have a therapeutic effect on the body, and they don't have enough radiation to be able to cause any significant harm to anyone being scanned. And this is true for healthy patients. My mother just got a PET scan, and she definitely doesn't have any type of cancer right now. So one of the things in the regulatory regime needs to be changed is for radiopharmaceuticals, because they're treated like conventional drugs right now, and that's a very stringent process. So for a single radiopharmaceutical, even if it's just an imaging agent, even with all the safety aspects that I mentioned, that it's such a small amount, it still costs about anywhere from 30 to 150 million to develop one of these drugs, and the reimbursement rates are a lot lower. So the ROI for these drugs are a lot lower as a result, with all the regulatory burden. So there's a push to change that with the FDA to, with more and more radiopharmaceuticals demonstrating that there's safety, that they're safe and efficacious, that, it doesn't need to go to such a strict regulatory regime in order to get them approved. And this way we can get more drugs onto the market that can, get better standards of care for patients that really need it without being held back. So that's one of the biggest costs for the industry, is why, a lot of, big pharma companies and, lobbyists might be advocating for.
Yeah. So before that happens, right now, if you know this, what's the cost of a treatment like this for a cancer patient? Yeah.
So let's use Novartis as example. So the imaging agent is, each scan is or each dose, actually, not even just a scan, is about $3,500 to $4,000 for the reimbursement rate, and then the therapy itself is $42,000 per dose. So it's not cheap, and that's drawn some backlash, especially for one of Novartis' assets, because it's so expensive to do so. But if you're at stage 3 and 4 cancer, you can kind of understand why, if you really don't have another choice to revert this cancer, that's one of the reasons it costs so much. And the flip side of the coin is that they have to recover their investment, because it is quite expensive to produce these drugs, given the supply chain and all the logistics that goes into it, and the regulatory burden to be able to bring this drug into market.
So for the cancer patients out there listening, how does it compare to the cost of other traditional treatments like chemo or immunology treatments for cancer?
I can't really speak to that for stage 3 and 4. Well, for any stage of patient, really, but I would imagine this is likely more expensive. I've had a couple friends with chemotherapy, and I've done a few market interviews with insurers on how much they reimburse chemotherapy. It's definitely not $42,000 per treatment course or dose, but at stage 3 and 4, chemotherapy and radiation therapy are not really an option anymore.
Right.
At that point, generally from my conversations with oncologists, radiation oncologists, and some radiologists, is that you're holding out hope that some of these options work outside of radiopharmaceuticals if you don't use that. So
Right. What are the other alternative treatments?
chemotherapy, radiation therapy,
Okay.
and at stage 3 and 4, you generally surgery is very uncommon. I don't know of a case. Then again, I'm not a doctor.
Right. Yeah.
But if tumors are everywhere, it's really hard to cut them out at that point. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess from there we move to a more hopeful point. If you look at the industry landscape now, after the FDA approval, the landmark approval of the drug that was bought by Novartis, my understanding is, as we read from the Twitter, there are a lot of activities happening with new startups, innovations. What stage are we at now? How mature are these startups, and how many years we have to wait perhaps for this to really take off as an industry? Give us a timeline.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no prognosticator, I guess, but I think that we're still in very early stages. I mean, since 2018, we've still really only had those same 3 drugs. And as I mentioned, one of the companies that has IPO'd already, Raise Bio, they are basically taking the same they're taking the same target, basically the same organic compound that Novartis had bought, and then they're attaching a different, more effective radioisotope to that compound for patients that Novartis' compound was not able to treat. That's really where the idea originally came from. I think we're still really in the early innings of radiopharmaceutical development, and a lot of large pharma companies are starting to get into the game. For example, with beyond just Novartis, there's also Bayer. They're the ones who commercialized a drug called Xofigo, and that's being distributed right now. And it's a lot of startups doing the heavy lifting right now to develop all these pipelines. As you mentioned, there's 60 clinical candidates and more than 100 preclinical candidates. A lot of them are really small pharma companies.
And who are the investors in this space right now? Are they mostly universities, or the big pharma?
So I think big pharma.
VCs?
They're basically all of the above. Universities are not the investors, but universities are the ones that, in a sense, they're the ones who invested in the basic research to be able to determine the targets, the organic compounds in the first place. That really gives the snipers the roadmap to be able to attack these different types of cancers, right?
Yeah.
We also have some big pharmas investing in companies that that might fit in with their existing pipelines, that might provide some kind of synergies with it. But for the most part, from a lot of these small companies, it's going to be VCs that fund this. Funds like Samsara Biocapital, Launch 2 Capital, and Venrock, Venbio. Those are the main funds that fund a lot of these bioscience startups, as well as Merck's venture arm. So
biotech VCs specializes in these. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So on the other side of the ecosystem, I guess, comes to the question of talent. How specialized is this knowledge, and in terms of the education resources in medical school, are we supplying enough doctors and technicians and scientists that are knowledgeable in this field?
I would say no. I think given that, I think a lot of the talent, there's a lot of overlap between conventional pharma and determining, a lot of the targets and compounds to be able to attack certain types of cancers. On top of that, you have radiochemists that we would need to basically, react these compounds together and do that type of research. I think that's very specialized, but I think it's a bottleneck that can be resolved. I have a couple colleagues that work on radiochemistry, and you can train, a normal chemist or really, another person who has experience in science, perhaps, just a regular researcher, and you can train them in radiochemistry. But I think that we definitely need more doctors who focus on oncology and doing a lot more of this type of research to be able to add to the firepower of this industry to keep developing. And I think that I don't know what the right amount is, but I think with the way that this industry is growing, you'll definitely need more people. Not just more people who are trained, but more people who are interested, who understand really what kind of influence that this can have on the cancer death rate and really driving that down severely. So
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we've covered a lot of grounds with this conversation, but for all my listeners out there wondering, what's your personal connection to this industry, and perhaps share with what you can about what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So so as you mentioned, up front, I was a PhD, I was a PhD student at UCLA, and I studied material science and engineering.
Yeah.
And one of the opportunities that came up was that my school's tech transfer office, which is basically the office that houses houses and manages all the patents of university professors that invent something from the research, and then they file it with the university, and the university essentially owns that patent. One professor one day just came into the tech transfer office essentially, and said that he wanted to commercialize this technology, and part of that deal was that he got a venture fellow from the office, which turned out to be me. And what happened there was that I supported the due diligence on this technology to basically understand his technology, understand its place within the market, and understand where it can be reimbursed and how it can support stakeholders across the whole landscape of radiopharmaceuticals. And I eventually told that professor that I wanted to be co-founders with him in founding a radiopharmaceutical startup that provides the infrastructure behind making the supply chain and distribution, manufacture, and drug development of these radiopharmaceuticals more efficient, less time consuming, and also shorten these drug development times to be able to get more of these drug candidates onto market. So that's kind of my connection to this industry, is having started a startup that doesn't necessarily focus on the drug asset, but focuses on kind of the overarching infrastructure and capital that really undergirds and supports the industry and ensures that it's more robust for the future when there is a lot of growth that is coming into the industry, and that it can be supported at the same time.
Yeah, that's a lot of materials you can use in the startup pitch.
Yeah.
But to simplify, you're making the tools to make the chemical compounds.
Exactly.
Radioisotopes. Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And I think, how long have you been working on this?
So we incorporated in about March of 2022. So about 18 months now, and we've been doing a lot of strategy up until now, and it was only until recently, as of last month or so, that we got about 3 SBIR. SBIR standing for Small Business Innovation and Research. That's a program in the United States where you get government grants to develop specific, aspects of your company that are in line with the goals of, what the government wants in terms of basic research and science.
Yeah.
And we've gotten about $850,000 so far. So that's a good start to be able to, hire a person or two.
Yeah.
To be able to, just explore somewhat risk-free. And we're going to use that to basically kind of launch our company and kind of take time to, in a very stepwise fashion, to determine where our niche is in the industry and how to establish ourselves.
So you're showing this stealth mode now.
Yeah.
Laying out the groundwork and getting 0 to 1.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think.
Well, I guess to be fair, not 0 to 1. I think that would be unfair to the rest of the industry, because we're putting together a technology that we think is radically different, but the markets already exist. The technology, exists already, and we're kind of taking it from, I would say, probably from, 3 to N, which is a lot easier than 0 to 1. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
but still a major improvement.
Yeah.
A lot of things you're contributing to the sector ecosystem on the whole. Um, I think in our previous conversation, you mentioned about a dream you had recently.
Yeah.
That just shows how obsessed you are with the startup you're working on, which is unrelated to your PhD field of thesis.
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah. No. So it was just kind of this one weird fever dream that I had, and after just one night after I woke up, and I think that it was about 6 months into the startup, and I had done so much market research, on prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancers that can't be screened. And I think the dream went that I woke up one day within the dream, and I realized I had pancreatic cancer. And I first thought, oh my God, I'm gonna die, because typically you find pancreatic cancers at around stage 4. And then after about an hour in the dream, or what seemed like an hour, I just didn't worry anymore, because I saw the developments that were happening in the industry, and there were tracers for pancreatic cancer that could be essentially relabeled from an imaging compound to a therapy compound. So I basically told that company, which does exist in real life, you only have an imaging compound right now. Why don't you just label it with a therapy compound and just inject it inside me, because I'm going to die anyway. And I think that it was a very weird dream, to be honest. But I think that it showed, like, I developed, I wanted to develop this technology with my co-founder, such that, we can come to a day where I myself am not going to be afraid of dying of pancreatic or another stage 4 cancer. And I really want people to be in that same boat with me, where they also, if it's good enough for me, that they also don't have to be afraid of dying of stage 4 cancer and saying goodbye to their loved ones as well. And I think that's, I think I'm probably thinking a little too much about my startup, from day in and day out. But I think that one weird dream is a sign that I'm probably in the right place. So
yeah. I think purpose is a very big overlooked factor behind a lot of successes.
Yeah.
If you're only there for the money, for the fame, it's not going to last very long, I think.
Right.
Working in the healthcare industry, in pharma, specifically on cancer as a class of disease that has haunted us for so long as a human race, I think it's a very meaningful pursuit.
Right.
In the startup you're working on. So I think with that, we can wrap it up today's conversation. We've learned a lot about the industry, the science behind it, the different players, and I'm glad we ended on this hopeful note and the dream, both the dream from your sleep and also the dream as your ambition to revolutionize the industry or play a small part in this transition. Yeah, thank you so much, Clincy, for your time and also for the work you're doing for cancer research.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.